Eric Horn here with Brett Dawson. We are in the Oklahoman news studios, and we are talking a little bit about Nick Collison today. You know, we saw this coming. Nick Collison announces his retirement from the Thunder, 15 seasons in the NBA. He announces it today, and you know, as expected, Nick Collison retires. A lot of people with a lot of reactions, all positive, of course.
Yeah, I mean, people love Nick Collison, and this is a guy who's been with one organization, technically one organization, for the length of his career. Started out in Seattle and then has been a part of the Thunder for all 10 seasons that it was in Oklahoma City. So a huge thing for I think for the community, much more so Nick Collison as a person leaving the organization, or at least leaving it as a player. We don't know what his future holds, than as a player. Obviously, as a player, not a contributor in recent years, but he's a guy who had value as both a starter and a bench guy, a power forward and center, had some moments in the playoffs. But this is a guy who's left a mark on the community and on the team, just as a locker room guy, as a leader, and really, along with Russell Westbrook in the post-Kevin Durant era, sort of the faces of the franchise.
Yeah, you know, we saw kind of the sprinklings of this happening throughout the season. You know, he re-signs last summer for 1 year. His family starts to come to more games. Russell Westbrook basically has that farewell kind of speech, or that you know, that kind of acknowledgement of him at center court at the Thunder's last regular season game. You know, even talking to a guy like Roy Williams, who showed up for Game 1 of the playoffs, his former coach at KU, you know, making an unexpected stop, a surprise visit for Nick Collison. We'd seen kind of the stages of this happening. You knew it was coming. It was just a matter of Collison eventually confirming it.
Yeah, you know, we sat down with him last summer, maybe after the season. I think it was. I know we sat in a conference room with him, and I can't remember exactly when it was. I think it was in the summer, and this was coming even then. I mean, I think he knew that this was probably the last year. He never wanted to say, you know, Nick's a guy who doesn't really make it about himself. And as we said, as a player, he wasn't a significant contributor anymore. He wasn't going to make the end of the season about him. That was just never really his way of doing things. Even exit interviews, he didn't want to come out and say he was doing this, but it was there in the tone. He was talking about life after basketball. He was talking about spending more time with his daughter, with his family. And as his minutes had kind of waned, he told us this year he still enjoyed the role he was playing. He occasionally came in and you know, he called them cameo appearances, and that's really what they were. He had a few nice minutes against San Antonio that I think will be the thing everybody remembers most from this season. But this has been going this way for quite a while, and I think we went into this year expecting this was it for Nick Collison. He just didn't want to make it, you know, again, as a guy who's not playing a lot, he was never going to be a guy who got rocking chairs and got saluted everywhere he went. He hadn't been a significant enough player in places outside Oklahoma City for a long enough time to do that.
Next question, you know, I mean, it seems a little bit quick to just move on from Nick Collison retiring, but you know, it's something that the Thunder's been preparing for quite some time. He isn't a guy who has significant rotation minutes probably the past 2 or 3 seasons. This is unequivocally Russell Westbrook's locker room now. He's the longest tenured Thunder player now. He and Nick Collison were both the longest tenured Thunder players still left on the roster. I mean, in terms of a roster spot, the Thunder's going to have an open roster spot. What does it say, if anything, or what does it determine for the Thunder going forward?
Yeah, probably not a whole lot. I mean, that roster spot, effectively what they've gained is a spot at the end of the bench that they really sort of had 2 big guys in that spot already. Dakari Johnson was sort of a guy who isn't playing a whole lot, and that's sort of his role. He's a backup center. He can play, obviously, a little bit younger and can play more extended minutes than Nick Collison if it comes to that, if they need him to. But, you know, it's an open spot, and they have that to sort of play with, but it's going to be an open spot toward the end of the bench.
Doesn't really necessarily determine whether or not they'll save anything on their tax bill either, because Collison was a guy who they had their bird rights for. They could go over the cap to sign. He signed a minimum contract. They're still going to fill that spot with somebody, whether it's a two-way guy or a guy that they sign outright in free agency. It's just a matter of how much they're willing to pay at this point.
Right, probably going to be another guy who's on the minimum, most likely. That's probably what you're going to be looking at. The other question, obviously, we don't know the answer to is what's next for Nick Collison. He talked about in his exit interview, he thinks there are some things he could do in basketball. He's not going to do that at the detriment of spending time with his family, and that could mean he spends some time with his family now and he looks at something down the road. It could mean that he looks in a position here or elsewhere, whether it's coaching, front office stuff. He would be a great broadcaster if that's what he wants to do. I don't think that, from the time commitment, maybe is not his thing, but you know, he'll have a future in basketball and probably a future with this franchise if he wants it.
Can't rule out the broadcasting angle. I'm glad you brought that up. You know, he's friends with a guy, Brent Barry, who we talked to before. They go way back from the Sonics days. Brent Barry's had his name thrown around in terms of some front office positions. You'd imagine that he'd probably get, Nick would get a recommendation from him in terms of being a guy who could potentially be a commentator. But Nick also has a daughter who's around 11, 12 years old, so he probably want to spend more time with her as well. And then there's the coaching angle. You know, the Thunder still hasn't filled a coaching position. I imagine if Nick Collison did want to become a coach someday, the Thunder would open their arms to bring him on staff, but that just hasn't been determined yet, and Collison hasn't made any determinations whatsoever.
Yeah, we've seen him, sometimes just because it was Kansas, but we've seen him at OU games with Sam Presti, and whether there's some kind of future in player evaluation, in some other front office capacity. I think if Nick Collison says, I want to be a part of this organization going forward, they're going to work to find a way to make that happen.
All right, well, check out our Nick Collison coverage. We got plenty coming. A lot of quotes, Kendrick Perkins, Jeff Green, a lot of guys from around the league going to be on newsok.com. Some great stories, column from Barry Trammell. So make sure to check it out on newsok.com and in Friday's Oklahoman.